Here's the best argument Dinesh D'Souza could muster for the afterlife.
Dinesh D'Souza, who's a frequent debating partner of mine, has written a book about this too, and the most persuasive example from any hospital he's found, and I get it all the time, is a woman who floated out of her body, out of the bed, made a tour of the outside of the hospital,
saw the shoe.
Noticed that there was a running shoe on one of the windowsills, woke up, reported it to a nurse, whose name we've never been told, and who went and looked, and there was the shoe. Now, if that doesn't prove it, I don't know what does.
There are a number of stories like these, but they're usually anecdotes. Here's an actual test of out-of-body experiences that has been conducted.
Reasonably serious people have tried to study the near-death experience, and this idea of consciousness somehow rising, dissociating from the body and rising to a point above the operating theater and looking down on the body, the phenomenology there is common enough that people seem to think that this is testable, and so some people have put random number generators on the top of cabinets in the operating theater, just on the odd chance that someone comes back saying, I saw this weird digital readout, above your cabinets, and it was, 35721. That would be very interesting. Now, no one, to my knowledge, has done that. But if people, this is something we could set up this experiment in advance. It wouldn't be merely anecdotal.
Have they put shoes up there? Because sometimes that...
Well, it's obviously structured along the same lines, but again, there's a reason why we can't make a research program based on that one shoe.
This study hasn't actually produced any positive results. Nobody has had an out-of-body experience in which they have seen the numbers. Even if they did, this still wouldn't prove an afterlife, even though it might be good evidence of remote viewing.
Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English.
Even if the afterlife were a coherent idea, which I don't believe to be the case, this issue poses the biggest challenge to that idea. Every apologist I've heard address this will either say that they don't know why it would be the case that damaging the brain damages the mind if the two are separate things, or they will espouse some ad hoc and falsifiable cop-out like, that's just the way Yahweh wants it, or we live in a fallen world. If the brain isn't necessary for the mind to exist, then why do we have brains to begin with? What is the point of all this hardware if the software can run on its own? You may have heard of Aben Alexander, the neurosurgeon who contracted meningitis and had a near-death experience and wrote a book called Proof of Heaven. In his book Waking Up, Sam Harris says this about Alexander's claims. Everything in Alexander's account rests on his repeated and unwarranted assertion that his visions of heaven occurred while his cerebral cortex was shut down, inactivated, completely shut down, totally offline, and stunned to complete inactivity. He claims that the cessation of cortical activity was clear from the severity and duration of my meningitis, and from the global cortical involvement documented by CT scans and neurological examinations. To his editors, this presumably sounded like science. Unfortunately, the evidence Alexander offers, in the article, in a subsequent response to my public criticism of it, in his book, and in multiple interviews, suggests that he doesn't understand what would constitute compelling evidence for his central claim of cortical inactivity. The proof he offers is either fallacious, CT scans do not measure brain activity, or irrelevant. It does not matter, even slightly, that his form of meningitis was astronomically rare. And no combination of fallacy and irrelevancy adds up to sound science. Alexander makes no reference to functional data that might have been acquired by fMRI, PET, or EEG, nor does he seem to realize that this is the sort of evidence necessary to support his case. Even if Alexander had EEG readings to back up his claims, unless the electrodes were implanted deep into his brain, they would not demonstrate that the brain totally stopped functioning.